Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
To all who shall see these greetings on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the world to the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Nate Janikin, Operations Officer here at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the United States government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of those in our community of interest who could not join us today, so we ask that you keep your own webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of our discussion, we'll have a question and answer session, so if you have a question, just type it into the group chat and I'll go through them in the order received. So China published an updated version of their doctrine titled The Science of Military Strategy in 2020. And in Chapter 9 of this document, they list new domains to focus on, specifically space, cyberspace, deep sea, polar, biological, and artificial intelligence. That's the order that they're mentioned in, so it's interesting to note that deep sea immediately follows space and cyberspace. They go on to mention that these domains are not only important for military conflict, but also an integral part of international political struggle. Today, we're going to focus on the deep sea. So NOAA defines deep sea as the point at which light begins to dwindle, which is around 200 meters or 656 feet, while the document previously mentioned states it between 300 meters and 1,500 meters. And in 2013, China began large reclamation projects that Admiral Harry Harris, who at the time was the commander of U.S. Indo-PACOM, called the Great Wall of Sand in March 2015, that notably now possess airfields on Fiery Cross, Mischief Reef, and Subi Reef. So with us today to continue the conversation is Mr. Drake Long. He's a non-resident fellow with the Krulak Center, a Pacific Forum young leader, and an analyst with the Department of Defense focused on examining territorial disputes. He previously covered maritime disputes in the South China Sea for Radio Free Asia and still writes on the topic occasionally for such outlets as 9-Line, The Diplomat, and the Center for International Maritime Security. He recently authored a chapter on new seabed disputes in the volume Maritime Cooperation and Security in the Indo-Pacific, Essays in Honor of Sam Bateman, and is currently writing a book on emerging issues around the exploitation and weaponization of the seabed for MCU Press. He received his master's in conflict resolution from Georgetown University in 2020. So with that, sir, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to kick this conversation off.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. So I'm actually going to take sort of the audience here back to about 2020, which is when one particularly noteworthy thing happened that I think kind of sets the tone for what I want to talk about today. In 2020, China's hydrological organization and its geographic commission released a list of about 50 names of undersea features in the South China Sea, stating that its scientific survey team had identified these undersea features and it had given them names appropriately. So some of them were given Chinese names, some of them were given names in keeping with sort of like other South China Sea features around the area. But what was particularly interesting about some of these undersea features was that they were completely underwater, and some of them were on the continental shelf, aka within 200 nautical miles of the Vietnamese coastline. So that was particularly interesting because also the features that were on the Vietnamese continental shelf area were also co-located with where a lot of Chinese survey activity had happened previously. So the sort of natural outgrowth of that, people were assuming, as China doing surveys in other countries' waters to identify undersea features. This might seem somewhat nonsensical, because what's the problem exactly? If it's for scientific research and you're identifying underground or undersea canyons, undersea mountains, undersea volcanoes, isn't that kind of like for the benefit of everybody? Well, there's a couple issues that sort of arose from this. Number one, China was giving them Chinese names, stating that this is sort of part of our undersea heritage, the South China Sea. It's not necessarily claiming ownership, but it's basically identifying them with Chinese markers in an area that is sort of designated as Vietnam's continental shelf, the parts of the soil underneath the ocean that Vietnam technically has sort of economic rights to. Two, in 2013, Li Xiaojie, the director of the State Cultural Administration of China, and then he went on to go be a deputy minister of culture in their Ministry of Culture. He made a statement that said, marine archaeology, aka identifying things on the ocean floor, identifying underwater heritage, is part of demonstrating our national sovereignty. So you take that sort of statement, you fast forward to 2020, and you can sort of see why states around the South China Sea area might actually have a problem with China going to the World Hydrological Organization and saying, hey, these are Chinese named features within Vietnam's coastline. A little problematic. This also followed in 2018, another prominent example of this, where China identified about 5 undersea features on what's called Benham Rise, which the Philippines claims basically as an undersea province, and stated that these 5 features on Benham Rise have Chinese names as well. It's a big sore point still in the Philippines today, which has since renamed Benham Rise Philippine Rise. So there's something quite interesting about that. But the reason that this is problematic is those features were also within 200 nautical miles of the Philippine coastline. At least some of them were. So I'm going to take a moment here to kind of clarify what I mean by continental shelf. And when I talk about economic rights to the seabed, what exactly we're talking about. So under international law, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, every coastal state has economic rights to an exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles off their coast. It's the waters, fishing rights, oil rights, what have you. They also have, under Article 76 of UNCLOS, a continental shelf, 200 nautical miles off of the coastline. The seabed there, the bottom of the ocean, they have economic rights to. It's not the same as sovereignty. It's not quite called like jurisdiction, but you have economic rights to it there. And then also UNCLOS has this provision that's called an extended continental shelf, which says that your exclusive economic zone is limited to 200 nautical miles. Your continental shelf can technically go beyond 200 nautical miles if you can find what's called a natural prolongation of the continental shelf. If you identify an undersea canyon or an undersea mountain chain that extends beyond 200 nautical miles from your coastline, you as a state can then go to the relevant UNCLOS legal body, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, and you can say, hey, my continental shelf actually goes a little bit further than 200 nautical miles. It goes, maybe 205 nautical miles, maybe it goes 300 nautical miles out, because I've identified this canyon that stretches out naturally from within that 200 nautical mile range. So the reason that's important is there was actually a recent legal case that was somewhat interesting between Colombia and Nicaragua that went to the International Court of Justice that I kind of want to highlight here because this is a relatively new development. I think the case was only decided in about July, so like last month. But you had a situation where Colombia and Nicaragua had a continental shelf dispute. They did not agree on where their continental shelf began and where it ended in relation to each other. Nicaragua was claiming an extended continental shelf that extended into Colombia's 200 nautical mile limit. So it was something unprecedented in that we haven't really seen many countries try to claim that their extended continental shelf can extend that close to another country's waters, basically. And the ICJ basically said, under UNCLOS, our ruling as judges is this can't happen. You can't claim an extended continental shelf that goes beyond 200 nautical mile limits. That basically violates another country's continental shelf. That violates the spirit of UNCLOS, how it was originally negotiated. Every country is supposed to have some sort of benefit from it. Either they have that 200 nautical mile limit themselves and you shouldn't be able to violate it, or if they're a disadvantaged state, as in like they don't have a coastline, they're supposed to get some of the proceeds, the financial benefits of other states drilling beyond 200 nautical miles. So the ICJ ruled you can't do this. And then what was interesting was there were a couple of dissenting opinions. There's a dissenting opinion by one judge that basically said, we can't say that Nicaragua's extended continental shelf violates Colombia's seabed rights because we don't have all the scientific information. This was not procedurally done correctly, which is, somewhat valid from a legal standpoint. The Chinese judge, which, if you know how international organizations work, each country kind of puts up a nominee for a key position. They have either an election or they have a nomination process. Then there's a lot of vote whipping where you either get your guy on the board or you don't. China is very well represented in a lot of the relevant law of the sea legal organs. That includes not only like the ICJ, but also the International Seabed Authority, World Hydrological Organization, and other scientific technical bodies that are not considered usually political. But the judge on this particular case, who was from China, wrote a separate opinion saying, I agree with the ruling. Nicaragua's extended continental shelf cannot extend into Colombia's territory, but for like a different reason, because she fundamentally had an issue with the idea that UNCLOS doesn't allow you to claim seabed territory, basically claim economic rights within the continental shelf of another country. She made the argument that, look, if we have information that there's a natural prolongation, an undersea canyon, some undersea feature that would logically allow Nicaragua to claim a longer continental shelf that violates Colombia's 200 nautical mile entitlement, we should take that seriously. And we just don't have the scientific information to validate that right now. But if we did, and we found that there was some reasonable geographic justification for a country to claim an extended continental shelf that violates another country's continental shelf, we should take that seriously. So I picked up on this, and a couple other international kind of legal, I guess, hobbyists noticed it too, because if you go back to 2020 and you look at what China's sort of claiming within Vietnam's continental shelf, this more or less seems to reflect the Chinese sort of position on the South China Sea's continental shelf. The continental shelf that you can claim, regardless of whatever situation your country is in, it is 200 nautical miles off of your coastline. So that's extending for some countries way beyond what would scientifically be called a continental shelf, and it's extending into the deep seabed. Because 200 nautical miles out, you have a certain drop-off point where it's no longer the continental shelf, you have the continental slope, and then you just have the deep seabed. If you have a continental shelf and you have an extended continental shelf claim that is more or less like not violated and upheld, you can actually basically claim economic rights to the deep seabed. And that's somewhat interesting. For China's island building activities in the South China Sea, as Paul, you sort of noted at the beginning here, the incentive to island build is basically evolving from before it was understood that you get to have economic rights, 200 nautical miles off of a recognized island. China and a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia actually disagree about what constitutes an island, but China especially is maintaining that its artificially built islands are entitled to an exclusive economic zone. They have economic rights to certain waters around each of those little islets. Now we're getting into territory where if you are claiming a continental shelf from those islands, and your position is that you can violate other countries' continental shelf entitlements that they have, then you have a recipe where you are pushing your jurisdiction outward and you're directly affecting the economic rights that other countries have to the seabed that's within their own coastline, basically. And it would appear that that's essentially the direction that China's sort of moving on. A lot of these international legal questions, the PRC doesn't really care. They do advance legal arguments that technically make sense from like a international legal standpoint, but it's sort of up for debate whether or not like you can claim heritage rights solely to justify basically sovereign claims over the seabed. Here, this is why the 2020 update to the science and military strategy was somewhat interesting, because China basically knows that the deep sea domain is something that they think is really worth investing in from both a policy perspective, a military perspective, and then also the scientific perspective. Most of the artificial islands they've built are doing a lot of scientific research. Most of the survey ships that are entering other countries' economic zones in the South China Sea are doing marine surveys, as in like they're scanning the seabed. And then it's not a coincidence that sometime later they find undersea features. So we have a situation now where you have this sort of creeping jurisdiction. You have this idea that you want to have economic rights to the seabed that incentivizes you to find the means to extend your seabed, your continental shelf, as much as you can. Under the extended continental shelf regime, if you have the geographic information for what's on the seabed and you can credibly claim, hey, there's an undersea canyon that starts, 100 nautical miles off of Woody Island, an artificially built up island China has in the South China Sea, and it extends 250 nautical miles further than that, then you submit an extended continental shelf claim, and you're saying that you have economic rights to the continental shelf for that whole span, up to 350 nautical miles away from Woody Island. And, whether or not you agree Woody Island is an island doesn't matter, because if you're China, you don't really care about that particular ruling anyway. And there's plenty of countries that would also join you in sort of disputing that. So that's the situation that we're in from sort of a legal standpoint. I have mentioned the phrase economic rights a lot, and one of the more dramatic developments lately is this new understanding of what economic benefits there are to the seabed in the first place. The whole reason for UNCLOS 3 back in about 1972 through 1982 was about the negotiating period. There was some sort of unsettled material when it comes to what a country owns in the ocean that needed to be dealt with. One of the big ones was the continental shelf, because countries, especially the USA and some other ones that have strong marine scientific programs, were realizing that there was resources on the bottom of the ocean, oil, gas, potentially rare metals. And they had to come up with some sort of way to make sure there were no disputes about it in the future. They came up with the continental shelf regime, which, as I said, gives you 200 nautical miles. If you can argue for a extended continental shelf, you can also have that. You have economic rights to that continental shelf. And if you're a disadvantaged state, you don't have a coastline, you just have a very small coastline, you should get like a certain fee on any deep sea mining activity that happens beyond 200 nautical miles, like a bank fund, basically, a trust fund for the seabed. So UNCLOS set this up, and then ironically, now that we have a lot more information about what's on the seabed, it seems to be creating something of the opposite result, where countries are trying to claim the largest continental shelf limits that they possibly can, because they want what is on the ocean floor. And what that is, well, frozen natural gas, which is highly valuable, and honestly, commercial extraction is not super far off. Marine genetic material, which has phenomenal uses in pharmacological research, most especially, if you look at COVID-19 test kits, if you want to get into that, part of the COVID-19 test kits was derived from some marine scientific research looking at marine genetic material. So the plant life, the animal life on the ocean floor has strong medicinal uses and some other scientific uses. Then the other big economic resource on the seabed is rare earth metals. So nickel, cobalt, these polymetallic nodules that have a mixture of rare earth metals in them that are used for everything from smartphones to electronic vehicles to even some like higher end sort of computer chips. Those are easier to find than they have ever been before. There used to be essentially a monopoly that was sort of held by the advanced Western countries that you would think, the USA and the European Union, over surveying and prospecting those rare earth metals. But things have shifted lately so that biggest investors in that sort of behavior, surveying for these rare earth metals, are now Japan, Germany, India, and then China is a very big one. China actually owns most, or at least half, of all mining prospecting licenses that are given out by the International Seabed Authority, which is the legal instrument that UNCLOS 3 set up to govern the international seabed, aka waters beyond national jurisdiction, anything that isn't within 200 nautical miles of any state that they can credibly claim. So we're seeing sort of this scramble for resources. Things are coming to a little bit of a head here because some private companies, most especially the metals company, TMC, they're starting to move towards not commercial extraction, but they're doing a lot of test mining in international areas, and the International Seabed Authority is more or less, for lack of proper regulation, kind of giving away those licenses. So it is proceeding steadily. The most recent development on that is the tiny island nation of Nauru has basically said, hey, we want to start commercial seabed mining extraction. We want to get licenses for that, which triggered a provision in the International Seabed Authority's laws stating that they have to come up with regulations for deep sea mining in 2 years. And if they don't have those regulations done by next year, basically, then deep sea mining can continue without regulation. which for a lot of environmental advocates is obviously not good. And then for a lot of countries that would like a little bit more time to get their scientific technical expertise up to par with countries like China, Japan, the USA, countries that just have more resources, that's just not a very good timeline for them. So things are coming to a little bit of a head here. But if there's one thing that I kind of want to leave everybody with, it's this fascinating trend, and I'm really trying to unpack it in this book I'm writing, whenever it's done, of this creeping sovereignty, this creeping jurisdiction, where countries have 200 nautical mile continental shelf limits. But then, well, I want economic rights to that area. What does economic rights look like? Well, it's not sovereignty, but in effect, you have all the benefits of sovereignty over that seabed. Okay, well then what's the natural result of that? I want more seabed. Okay, well, we'll have the extended continental shelf. We're seeing countries come forward with some exotic arguments for extended continental shelves. Nicaragua's is, hey, we have a natural prolongation that violates Colombia's continental shelf limits. Therefore, we should have more of their seabed basically to economically exploit. There's another case that I believe is from the early 2000s between Libya and Tunisia, where Tunisia argues we should have economic rights to a certain part of the seabed for historical rights purposes, heritage, basically. We have fishermen that are very active in the area. It's very important to Tunisian history. Therefore, we should have economic rights to that small part of the seabed. The ICJ, in that circumstance, determined, no, that's not accurate. The only way that you can have heritage rights to the seabed is if you can prove you have constant habitation and like a certain level of constant presence in that area. Now, fast forward to 2013, China's state archaeological institute basically says, hey, undersea archaeology is great for defending national sovereignty. Then you have the discovery of multiple shipwrecks in the South China Sea. You have artificial island building from about, I want to say 2015, 2016. You have the effort to build serious towns with serious jurisdiction, prefecture level cities on these artificial islands in the South China Sea. You're exercising jurisdiction over them. You're proving you have people living there. And then you have these survey fleets that are going out into Vietnam, Philippines, and we're also seeing quite a few in Malaysian continental shelf limits that are identifying undersea features. They're usually accompanied by China Coast Guard ships. And they're also finding economic resources on the seabed in those countries' continental shelves that they're not going to share with those countries, but China themselves would be fairly interested in. So the incentive to extend your continental shelf is there. The incentive to maximize the amount of resources you can have is there. You have creeping sovereignty. You have a continental shelf regime that was never set up to give countries the idea that they owned part of the seabed. And now they're more or less practicing de facto sovereignty over the seabed that they have, if they can enforce it. And that trend, from my perspective, is probably only going to increase. And in certain areas like the South China Sea, which even though parts of it, honestly, you could make the argument it should be international waters, it should be beyond national jurisdiction. Because of the volume of disputes, no treaty on international waters will really apply the South China Sea. There's only incentives for countries to maximize their claims, and the country with the biggest benefit right now and the biggest advantage in resources on marine surveys, undersea archaeology, and all these other sorts of activities you need to enforce an extended continental shelf is China. So that's sort of one chapter of the book that I'm writing. We mentioned the science and military strategy, but this is not strictly a PRC thing. India is pumping massive state resources into trying to mine commercially the continental shelf just off of its shore in the Indian Ocean. Japan technically has first mover advantage in a lot of seabed mining applications. They were the first ones to really extract a lot of frozen natural gas from within their continental shelf, and they proved it could be done. And then if you look at undersea strategies, there's a science and military strategy which China put out. France also has one. The USA kind of has one. The UK put out a policy document on the topic. Australia and New Zealand kind of mention it in their respective policy documents. And if you read into some of the more obscure ones, Vietnam has put out a critical mineral strategy where it says explicitly we should explore mining the seabed a little bit more. mining our continental shelf a little bit more to get critical minerals for things like electric vehicles. So a lot of states are kind of jumping on this. China's not the only one. It's the one I'm highlighting in this talk, but it's by far the norm and not the exception. So that's sort of my beginning spiel. I know that's sort of a lot, but it's a very interesting sort of topic with a lot of legs to it, and I'm more than happy to take some Q&A or discuss the topic further in detail on any of those points I sort of brought up.
Yeah, I think one of the things I was thinking about, you talking about having an extended presence, and I immediately thought of the Philippine Navy running aground the Sierra Madre in the Thomas, was it Second Thomas Atoll?
Second Thomas Shoal. Yep.
Yeah, so basically ran that, a formerly U.S. Navy LST ran it ashore and basically has had a continuous presence there with Philippine Marine Corps folks, on that ship the whole time. And now it kind of makes more sense to me, like listening to you, why would you want to do that? And then just so I was tracking, you were saying that basically, they can build up an island, then they're claiming the 200 nautical mile economic zone based on the continental shelf from that island. And then are they building like basically building a mountain or building a trench that would then go even further to then say, hey, we can go beyond that as well? And then using that argument for Nicaragua and Colombia and basically saying like, oh yeah, well, we can claim this area even though it belongs to somebody else. Is that kind of their goal?
So you don't have to build anything. So the reality is, the ocean floor is mostly unmapped. I want to say like the recent estimate is we have about a third of the seabed actually mapped out in some type of detail. If you have the survey fleet, and China has the largest state-owned survey fleet in the world, you will find undersea features that you can then say like, hey, I identified this canyon. And it's all up for debate. Like the legal instruments, the courts don't have the technical means to evaluate every single extended continental shelf claim in like a ton of detail. If you're China and you send a survey ship into Vietnamese waters and you identify an undersea canyon, you can argue that the peak of the undersea canyon down to the slope of it runs into your 200 nautical mile continental shelf, which means you then should have an extended continental shelf that goes along the rest of the length of that undersea canyon. You're not building anything. You're just identifying features on the ocean floor, of which there are a lot, and not a lot of countries have that data. Vietnam has a survey program that, it's normal for like a country of its size and GDP. They don't have the same capacity that China does. So China almost certainly knows more about their continental shelf than Vietnam does. So when China makes these kind of claims, it's very hard to kind of hit back and say, no, your continental shelf can't go that far into our territory. It's not legally viable, but they don't have all the information. In the Nicaragua case, what I was just saying there is that, this is actually a very good point to say here, is international law is in some ways incentivizing this kind of what I would call like gamemanship of continental shelf limits. So the Tunisia and Libya case is really good here, where the ICJ says, it's kind of like an aside. They're like, look, you can't claim undersea heritage and extend your continental shelf that way. It doesn't work. If you're going to claim undersea heritage, you have to have some like continuing presence in the area, or you have to prove that like you have people there basically enforcing that for you. Fast forward, you're building artificial islands. China, Philippines grounded the Sierra Madre, and you have all these fights over proving that you have people in disputed parts of the South China Sea. The argument there is you want to have that presence because that's what the ICJ told you kind of have to prove your claim. On the Nicaragua and Colombia case, Nicaragua and Colombia, that separate opinion states that we shouldn't violate Nicaragua's claim just because it violates UNCLOS's spirit. We should evaluate it on whether or not there actually is an undersea feature that extends into Colombia's continental shelf. And then fast forward, and China is basically saying like, no, that's our position too, basically, that if we find an undersea canyon that extends into another country's continental shelf, we should also own economic rights to that continental shelf. So everything kind of leads on to one another, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, it does. So it's a little bit of a, oh, I'm claiming this because I found it, but if nobody else can prove that you did or did not actually find it, they really
Yep.
can't say one way or the other because they don't have proof. You know, the burden of proof is essentially on everybody else, not the
Yeah.
country that's making the claim.
And as the ICJ puts out these evidence tests where it's like, look, if you're going to claim an extended continental shelf, you need this information and this information. As they get into more concrete, criteria for that sort of thing, states are finding that criteria. They're saying like, okay, I mean, if I need to prove that I have a continuous presence in the South China Sea, I can do that.
Yeah, and just to go back on your point of how much of the seabed is actually mapped, I remember, and I wrote down so October 2nd, 2021, the USS Connecticut, a Seawolf class submarine, struck an underwater mountain in the South China Sea. And then the USS San Francisco in January of 2005 also struck an undersea mountain off the coast of Guam. I think what we had just talked about might answer Albert's question a little bit. Albert was asking, differing national access or ownership of survey ships affecting the ability to stake the continental shelf claims, which I think you kind of pointed out. But they also brought up, Turkish survey ships in the Mediterranean. So, thinking about how big the South China Sea is, and I know our focus today is kind of on, China's efforts in these seabed mining and seabed disputes, but looking at the Mediterranean, which is a much smaller water feature, and I would venture to guess that, 200 nautical miles off the coast of southern France probably gets, pretty wicked close to Africa and the nations that are in North Africa.
Yeah, so this was essentially considered an issue all the way back as the 1980s when UNCLOS was really being finalized in UNCLOS 3, the third convention. So this was a concern that was brought up, was marine scientific research. And if you query countries, most especially Southeast Asian countries, on what they think about UNCLOS, this still is an issue about when do you need permission to do a survey in another country's territory. The original spirit of UNCLOS states that because it's a scientific survey with no military applications, you should be able to do surveys for the good of all mankind in other countries' territorial waters or exclusive economic zone without a problem. The problem is that nowadays it's essentially impossible to tell what is like a valid scientific survey with no military applications and one that has military applications because the equipment's just gotten so much more complex. So if you're China or Turkey or whatever, and you want to identify really good submarine routes through the South China Sea or the Mediterranean, or you want to identify those undersea features that you can then claim as an extended continental shelf, you're going to say that my survey vessels are doing purely scientific research. They should be able to be in your territory, no problem. In China's case, they also accompany them with China Coast Guard ships, which, basically scare off any sort of policing presence that Vietnam or the Philippines might send out there. And I find it somewhat ironic because actually, if you go back to UNCLOS 3, like the actual text of the negotiations, the strongest arguer, like the strongest champion of the idea that you need to ask for permission before doing a survey in the country's waters is China back then. They flat out say like, no, you can't do that. You have to ask our permission before you go through our waters. Fast forward to now, and China's basically saying like, we don't have to ask for your permission, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, if we're doing a survey in your waters. So it's basically a complete 180.
Yeah, you're doing really well and feeding into Albert's questions because you're talking about technology. So Albert says, since Japan got mentioned as having first mover advantage as the first to demonstrate the viability of seafloor mining, what is the state of technological play for the various nations currently conducting or interested in seabed mining? And are there any specific tech or experiences that serve as dividing lines on how sophisticated these activities are?
So it's a complicated issue. So there's recently been a high seas treaty that's kind of been drafted and finished where it's talking about these areas beyond national jurisdiction, beyond 200 nautical miles or what have you. Like, what do we do with those areas? And one of the sticking points in those negotiations was for a lot of what we call disadvantaged states. They're either underdeveloped countries or they don't have a coastline, period, under UNCLOS. Disadvantaged states were arguing, we want technology transfer to be part of the treaty. Like Pacific Island countries in particular, they have a massive exclusive economic zone. Micronesia has a massive continental shelf that it can't patrol, and it doesn't actually have the technical expertise to map every part of its seabed. But it wants it, and it's trying to make the argument that, like, for a country like Japan, you should share that technology with us. But that's intellectual property, and a lot of countries simply don't want to do that. The state of technological play is basically there is a dividing line between the states that have first mover advantage. They've pioneered seabed mining and seabed prospecting. That's Japan, Belgium, Germany, and to a lesser extent, like Australia and the USA. And then you have the countries that are pioneering commercial extraction, as in they have the technology to go from prospecting to commercial extraction at scale, as in making money off of this. That is China, Japan again, and India. I mean, that's basically what I would assess are kind of doing right now. Then you have some private companies like the Metals Company, which is trying to do it on a threadbare budget. Like it's basically a tech startup, and they're trying to do commercial seabed mining. But you know, their share price has plunged greatly lately because of increased regulation on seabed mining. They probably don't have the funds to like make that up. Whereas a country like China could just keep throwing money at the issue. India has no qualms about that either. So you're going to see a strict divide between the countries that pioneer it and the ones that actually get it to a commercial level and prove that you can really make money doing this.
I'm noticing a trend in my last couple of brewcasts that the cash is king. So if you could pay for it, it's going to be yours.
Yeah, and here's an issue where the USA is a prominent scientific leader in like seabed research, but it's mostly privatized, or it's done through like university partnerships. Like we have a massive survey fleet, but we can't control it like necessarily. So it's a little bit more complicated for us. If you're a university and you want to do seabed research, you're usually partnering with like a university in China or India or Japan or something like that to get out there. And those inputs don't necessarily come back to the USA for commercial extraction. We're not necessarily pursuing that really.
So the next question comes from Howard, and they ask, could you explain how significant this continental shelf gamesmanship is in terms of the size of excessive economic exclusion zones being claimed or could potentially be claimed? In your example of extending a claim measuring from an undersea canyon, is this primarily a concern for international law, given your great point about asymmetric information about undersea features, or is it primarily a concern for the economic implications from exclusive access to the additionally claimed resources?
Good question. It's actually a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. So first of all, this is something I didn't really want to get into, but I do have to point this out. There's a difference between the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf under UNCLOS. The exclusive economic zone is 200 nautical miles, and that's the water column. So you have fishing rights. And then UNCLOS was set up to figure out, like, okay, so what about the seabed? And they decided that as a neat little like package deal, the continental shelf limit would be 200 nautical miles as well. So your EEZ and your continental shelf limit match. You have economic rights to the water, you have economic rights to the subsoil. That's great. Problem is, you can have extended continental shelf, which means that goes beyond your exclusive economic zone. So you're not claiming, some countries do claim an excessive EEZ. China does that in the South China Sea as well. But the continental shelf situation is different because you can have that extension through that natural prolongation criteria I set out, where you might be claiming the subsoil of another country's EEZ, but that other country has the water column right above it. And honestly, we haven't gotten to the point where that's become like a huge sticking point. I think on the questions of what this is a concern for, it's a concern for international law. It is a massive concern, I would say, for the economic implications, but primarily because this is a concern for like the national security community as well, because it's incentivizing disputes. You're incentivizing countries to claim a massive continental shelf to have as much access to the resources as possible. You're also incentivizing coastal states to be really belligerent in enforcing their continental shelf limits, which again, I gotta emphasize this, they're not geographically like sensible. Legally, under UNCLOS, the 200 nautical mile continental shelf is what you get. But from a scientific perspective, the continental shelf is like a scientific term that terminates before many countries' actual legally claimed continental shelf ends. There's a difference there. But now there's essentially no difference being practiced because the seabed is just as valuable as the continental slope in a lot of cases. So countries want to maximize their claims. The economic implications are big for countries that want to dominate future tech, emerging tech especially. If you want to go into electric vehicles, if you want to work on semiconductors, you want to work on smartphones, you need access to those resources. The only real deposits of rare earth metals are, I believe, the Congo is a big one. I believe Tibet has quite a few, or I guess Xizang, whatever the PRC calls it now. That has a high degree of like rare earth metal deposits, and I think they found some new stuff up in Sweden. But if you can't get favorable access to those things, the next best option is the continental shelf. It's the seabed. So countries are very incentivized if they want to be emerging tech leaders and kind of leapfrog in the world economy. They do have an incentive to try to maximize their claims there as well. And then that leads into a security issue because then countries have seabed disputes. We've already had a few. They've been dealt legally perfectly fine. But when you have a situation like China where the asymmetry of power is so great, you have Coast Guard ships venturing into other countries' territory and hosing down those other countries' ships that try to come near it. That's a dispute. And it's not a good situation. So, you know, I guess yes to both of those questions.
The one that I thought of just now as you were talking, how does the 12 nautical mile territorial water, you know, that's split between territory and international waters, how does that factor into all this? Because obviously, you know, that's well within the EEZ, but, you know, does it have any effect on anything else?
So there's a massive gray area between the continental shelf limit and the territorial and the contiguous zone too. So the territorial sea is 12 nautical miles, contiguous zone is 24 nautical miles. The continental shelf limit is 200 nautical miles plus, up to about like 350 nautical miles. So between the 24 mark and the 350 mark, you can basically interfere in that area all you want, and you're not touching anything that technically a country has like sovereignty over. So it's a gray zone. I hate using that term, but it basically is. Like if you look at China's activity, they're usually pretty circumspect about sending survey ships within 24 nautical miles of another country. They don't really want to do that. I think it provokes more than they probably want to do. I don't know, I can't get in their mind. But at the same time, there's a lot of water to play with between 24 nautical miles and 200 nautical miles, where you can simply go in and say like, hey, this is my extended continental shelf. This is still a dispute. You know, we haven't actually settled the limits of my continental shelf and your continental shelf, Malaysia or Vietnam. So why can't I be here? You know, it's not technically your territory. So that's what I think is hard for us to grasp, is it becomes very clear what a country can do in 24 nautical miles or 12 nautical miles. Like you're violating their territory pretty clearly. It's the rest of that water column, the rest of that continental shelf limit where it gets very ambiguous and there's not a good precedent being set.
Yeah, that makes sense. Albert and I had a very similar question coming in. So Albert says, in the South China Sea, the obvious example of belligerence related to the EEZ or extended continental shelf claims would be the Chinese survey ships. But are there other examples of specific areas of interest for seabed mining that aren't as prominent for the time being?
Yeah, so like I said, 30% of the world has not been mapped out yet, or 30% has only been mapped out yet, but they are finding these deposits, these areas that they think are probably hotbeds for natural resources. A huge one is actually in the Indian Ocean. There are hydrothermal vents, underground volcanoes, whatever you want to call them, on the ocean floor that have rare earth metal deposits in them. Right now, you're not seeing any commercial extraction, but part of the reason India is pumping a lot of money into a commercial seabed mining enterprise and research is because a lot of that lies on their continental shelf, or what they claim as a continental shelf. So the Indian Ocean will probably be problematic sometime in the future. You know, there's still some sovereignty disputes over areas like the Chagos Islands and whatnot, where you're going to have the potential for a little bit of conflict, I think. Not like shooting conflict, but some legal back and forth about who owns what and who has sovereignty over what. The other area is the Pacific Islands area. I mean, we've seen Chinese survey ships venture like way outside of the South China Sea. We've seen them in areas like, I think, within the exclusive economic zone and the extended continental shelf limit of Palau. A lot of these Pacific Island countries have massive continental shelves that they can't patrol, and they can't explore it, really. They can't patrol it. And other countries are starting to sort of edge in there, and it's becoming a bit of an issue. That's why they argue for technology transfer. That's why a country like Nauru is partnering. I shouldn't say partnering, but it's basically working with private sector companies like the metals company, TMC, to open up seabed mining faster than the International Seabed Authority is prepared to do, because they want to get in on it like as fast as possible. They want to get private sector expertise. They want to get access to those resources that they think they have. And the Pacific Islands area especially seems to have quite a bit. And then the specific area of interest that, is of very interest to me right now, because the High Seas Treaty has been finished. It hasn't been totally adopted by every state yet, but the High Seas Treaty governs the issuance of mining licenses in international waters. And the Clarion-Clipperton Fracture Zone is a massive area of international seabed that China already owns most of the mining licenses to, but other countries are getting involved as well. That's where TMC did their pilot programs. That's going to be an interesting area to watch. Not in terms of, I would say, conflict, but just in terms of like, if you can prove commercial extraction in that area of the international seabed, that will be one, like, that'll be groundbreaking. It'll prove that you can do commercial extraction of seabed resources basically anywhere. And I think that's going to spark a huge race for continental shelf seabed mining closer to shore. And two, it'll be utterly devastating to the environment. It'll destroy the ecology of the deep seabed, which is something that we haven't covered yet. But there have been reports that say that even the noise pollution from seabed mining, from very small scale seabed mining, destroys international seabed, like the ecosystems on the ocean floor. Some of the most fragile ecosystems on the planet. The organisms that live there are accustomed to no change in their environment for thousands of years. And then if you have any machinery down there whatsoever, the creatures die. The marine genetic material that we want down there dies. So the ecological devastation in that international seabed area, I think, it'll be quite bad if we get to commercial extraction level. Not quite there yet, but those are the kind of the areas I would watch. I would look at Indian Ocean, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, and the Pacific Islands area, which I know is a large zone, but basically look at those EEZs of countries like Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Palau, and that gives you a pretty decent geography to be worried about.
Yeah, I think my follow-up, similar idea to what Albert was thinking about was we've seen, so it seems like China's the one that's going, super hard in the paint on this. If excuse my sports reference.
No, it's true. It's true.
Is there anybody else? Kind of sounds like maybe India is a little bit, but it doesn't seem like they're going as hard as China is in terms of like, I don't want to say wild claims, but some claims that the international courts have said, hey, that that's not an island. I was writing down some stuff today, and I was like, Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, Fiery Cross Reef, like the names of those that we use don't say island, they say reef. And I feel like that's very intentional. So is there anybody else that's going or approaching the levels that China is in terms of disputes and all that kind of stuff?
Well, we talked about Nicaragua, which is that case was, some people, you can quibble with how it was ruled. I think it's generally probably a good idea not to set the precedent that countries can violate other countries' continental shelf limits, like within their 200 nautical miles, just because you think you have an undersea canyon that extends in there. Like that would be somewhat egregious if that occurred, because then you will just have countries claiming that all over the place. So that's problematic. There's really more of in terms of like revisionism at the scale that I would say China's sort of doing, where it's sort of introducing a lot more complex conflicts into the South China Sea with its seabed activity. The only other country that really comes to mind is Russia, because they famously planted that flag at the bottom of the Arctic. They do have Arctic claims that are, many people would argue, excessive. It's just, I think right now, it's just not considered a priority because Russia actually, they have a massive icebreaker fleet, but they don't have near the survey fleet that China does. China has a whole other level of it. And then a lot of smaller, disadvantaged states that don't like how their coastlines are set up, which, to be fair, like they have something of an argument in that they were given kind of a raw deal. Countries like Somalia, Nicaragua, what have you, they're all unhappy with the continental shelves that they have, and they're trying to change them in ways that are beneficial. Somalia and Kenya had a dispute over their continental shelf that I think left neither side particularly happy, because the ICJ basically stepped in and said, I'm going to draw a line. That's going to be your new continental shelf. Kenya was more unhappy with that than Somalia, and they're almost certainly not going to let that go. India, in terms of belligerence, is actually probably not that problematic because they haven't really tried to press at the outer ends of their extended continental shelf yet. Some countries like Japan, they do have artificial islands that their continental shelf limits break into Palau's, and it's becoming a little bit of an issue. But that's something that can probably be hammered out in international court. It's not so much the disputes themselves, it's just how countries deal with it. Do they take it to court? Do they try to enforce it with, a massive survey fleet backed up by Coast Guard, or do they let it go? And I think what you're seeing is countries like China and Russia, to a lesser extent Nicaragua, are much more belligerent about that. Venezuela is somewhat belligerent about that because of oil rights and stuff in the oceans off its coast. And then you have a lot of other countries that have problematic continental shelf claims, but they've actually hammered out agreements between each other, like Malaysia and Indonesia and Vietnam and the Philippines are slowly moving towards some compromises. I'm probably going to misstate this, but I do believe Indonesia and Malaysia have hammered out a sort of accord. Or no, I think it's Vietnam and Malaysia actually. Yeah, they hammered out an accord that said like our continental shelf is here. This is an overlapping area that we both have. We both have some rights to it. We're just going to get this off the table and deal with it later. And that's a promising sign, because most people would point out that a lot of Southeast Asian countries are just as bad, if not worse, than China when it comes to South China Sea. That's no longer the case. They are moderating their claims, whereas China just seems to be going towards that more maximalist position. So really wordy answer, but I think that I actually think it's not that unusual to say that China's kind of in a league of its own on this stuff. That's why I have a whole chapter in my book dedicated to it. Because if you want to talk about the pioneering aspects of creeping jurisdiction, China's pioneering a lot of these methods by saying, I found a shipwreck under the ocean. I should have access to it. I have access to that continental shelf. Hey, I found an undersea canyon in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. That's my undersea canyon. I should have continental shelf rights to that undersea canyon. They're pioneering a lot of this behavior. And I think other countries might take cues, but they really are sort of in a category of their own.
Yeah, there Albert points out that a good compromise is one that everyone's mad about the outcome. I did have one follow on. You were talking about, we've seen survey ships outside the South China Sea. I know China has a PLAN naval base in Djibouti. Yeah. Have we seen survey ships out in the Med or in Africa?
That I'm not entirely sure. We do see survey ships off the coast of East Africa. They're not specifically Chinese. So, I mean, every country has their own attitude about whether or not a survey ship can cross into their exclusive economic zone. Some countries don't really mind. Some countries partner with other countries for that sort of behavior. India does survey flights up and down the east coast of Africa, usually with the cooperation of countries there. Sometimes not, but for the most part, yes. China, I don't believe, has done survey ships off of Djibouti, but if they had, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. I think that because it's much easier to prospect and mine closer to home, naturally they want to go into areas like the South China Sea or the Pacific Island area, where they can show up and they can say, hey, we identified these resource deposits. It's either ours, like we should have economic rights to it, or in the case of the Pacific Islands, China does say like, hey, partner with us, we'll mine it, we'll give you some of what we have there, just give us an exclusive contract, and we'll mine it for you. And I think that argument is pretty easy to make to a lot of disadvantaged countries.
The last question as we close out, is there anything keeping semi-covert seafloor mining from being as pervasive as illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing throughout the Pacific and other oceans? It seems like tech might be the big reason.
Yeah, tech is a big thing. It's tough. I mean, you have to have the scientific instrumentation. You have to have a ship that can carry all of that stuff. Covert seafloor mining is probably not possible. So when I'm talking about survey ships, they're prospecting. They're finding the resource deposits to figure out where they should mine later. When you set up a mining rig, so we basically know what a mining rig for deep seafloor mining kind of looks like. It's not what you might expect. It's a large ship at the top that stays in place. There's a massive cable connecting it to a crawler, a literal like seafloor crawling machine that just crawls across the seafloor, picks up polymetallic nodules, scrapes them up, and then shoots them up a chute back to the ship. There's no way to do that like covertly. I mean, if it does get done covertly, like I'd be shocked in all honesty. But I think that you simply can't hide it as much as you can illegal fishing. You can't get a maritime militia to go do it for you. You know, sensors they've gotten cheaper and they've gotten smaller, but they haven't gotten that cheap and they haven't gotten that small. What you see instead, what's as pervasive as IUU fishing, is you have survey fleets that will make a show of force kind of going into another country's EEZ and saying, hey, I'm just doing a survey here. You can't do anything about it. I have plausible deniability. And in actuality, the survey ship could be doing all sorts of stuff. They could be identifying undersea features for an extended continental shelf claim. They could be identifying resources. They could be identifying really good submarine routes for warfare in the future at some point. And the coastal state honestly just can't tell. You cannot tell from the coast of Vietnam what that survey ship is really doing, no matter what they may tell you. So yeah. And then, you know, it's also just like a money thing, you know. The ships are expensive. The expertise is expensive. Processing all that data is very expensive. Illegal fishing is like easy. You know, I knew people that would go fishing like in the Great Lakes or whatever, and they're not technically supposed to do that, but like, it's not as if they have a signature. It's a little wooden boat. There's nothing to it. If you have large survey ships, you know, that's going to show up on radar. Most of what I do when I'm doing this book is I'm just looking at the radar tracks of these various ships on ship tracking software that's free to use. They're technically associated with the International Maritime Organization. They have a registry. You can track them that way. So it's a highly visible activity. It's not semi-covert. And it can't be as pervasive because of the costs, because of the investment. But what it can be is it can be a little bit more plausibly deniable, because you're technically doing scientific research of some kind. And if you're mining, well, I mean, it's usually going to happen when you have like a mining license. So yeah, it's a unique situation, but I wouldn't necessarily conflate the two.
Great. We have a few more minutes left. I think we're going to close out the questions there. I just wanted to kick it over to you to see if you had any closing comments before we finish up the episode.
Yeah, the last thing I would sort of say here is this is a moving target. The ruling that stated that, you know, Nicaragua can't have a natural prolongation violate the country's continental shelf, that was like last month. And there's more cases like that pending. Every country basically has extended continental shelf claims, most of which have not been decided on by any sort of international court. They're not going to be decided on anytime soon. But as they get decided, as we have seen, the incentives to maximize your continental shelf grow because you don't want to lose out on the resources. And two, those cases give you basically advice on how to enforce your continental shelf claims. If it's through underwater heritage, if it's through a natural prolongation or what have you, like it basically informs each country what they need to do that. So the thing to pay attention here are the pioneers. Countries like France are a pioneer. People don't think of it. France has a massive exclusive economic zone in the Pacific Islands area. And what they do with seabed mining does affect the rest of the world. What they're doing right now is they're calling for a ban. They're saying, I don't want any seabed mining at all because we don't see any benefit to it. It's ecologically devastating. The other side of that aisle is China, which is pioneering a lot of these tactics to maximize your continental shelf and exploit it as much as you can. So pay attention to the pioneers, like see what they say, see what they're doing, and take seriously the idea that even if a country doesn't technically have sovereignty under UNCLOS, there's a such thing as de facto sovereignty over the seabed. And we are seeing that start to emerge, and it's very problematic. So that's my last, I guess, warning, I suppose.
Great, thank you. So that'll close out our episode today. Thank you, Mr. Long, for your time and your insight. It's been super interesting. And thank you to everybody that tuned in live today in the chat with some really solid questions as well. So that's all we have for today. So go ahead and carry out the plan of the day.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you have enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.